what a way to kick off the 2011 season of Rocky Gamers. We had Nintendo's mascot kicking off the 2010 season, and now we have Sega's mascot. Yes, it is of course Sonic the Hedgehog for the SEGA Master System, and even though we've already looked at the original SEGA Genesis or Mega Drive version, depending on where you are in the world, it should be known that these games are actually quite different. Of course they're played the same, like any other side-scrolling video game featuring Sonic the Hedgehog, but when it comes to level design, level selection and ending bosses, there is a difference between the two. Now we should bring the SEGA Game Gear version into play here, because even though the level design is very similar, if not the same, to the SEGA Master System version, the bosses are actually considered to be easier. Nonetheless, they are still harder than the SEGA Genesis or Mega Drive version, and I do aim to review the SEGA Game Gear version eventually, although that will have to be using Sonic Mega Collection Plus for the PlayStation 2, because unfortunately I do not currently own a SEGA Game Gear. Now the basic rules of survival in Sonic the Hedgehog games is to always have at least one ring, do not fall down bottomless pits, do not get crushed, and do not drown. You may have noticed in this version that you don't get to pick up your rings again if you lose them, making the game a bit harder. Also, when you gain 100 rings, you will be reset back to 0 rings. You will of course get the extra life, but your ring count will of course be lower than it was. But that doesn't really matter, as you cannot pick up your rings again if you lose them anyway. And in the end, getting the extra life is worth it, because at the end of the game, the amount of lives you have left is tallied, I believe it's 5,000 points each, and added to your total score. If you have at least 50 rings in your possession at the end of an act, then you get to access the special stage, which is full of rings and I believe a television box for a continue. I didn't manage to find this, as this was my only special stage I went through during the recording of the footage for this review. Be rest assured that they do differ in terms of layout and can get quite hectic due to the amount of springs about, and with most other special stages in Sonic the Hedgehog games, they are crazy. Now here is a big difference. Each emerald is actually found in the second act of each zone. I believe it's the second act of every single zone in the SEGA Master System and SEGA Game Gear version of this game, unlike the SEGA Genesis or Mega Drive version where they're actually found in the special stages. I used to know where these all were, but obviously I'm a little rusty and I haven't played this version of the game in a while. Here's the bridge level, which wasn't in the original game, but I think it should have been, because I love the fact that the screen is pushing you to go further at a steady rate, which means you must not go too fast nor too slow. And I must mention that this game is actually a slower paced game than the SEGA Genesis or Mega Drive version of it, and that is shown by, of course, what you're seeing on screen and the music you can hear. The music in this game actually keeps up with the pace of the level and is simply awesome. There's no other word for it. Here's the first boss of the game, and as you can see it greatly differs from the SEGA Genesis or Mega Drive version of it, even though this is still Green Hill Zone. And I should add that all boss levels in this game have no rings, so if you get hit, you will lose a life. And there are some exceptions to this, of course. If you've already got a shield from the previous level, then you do get an extra opportunity. Now here's a fine example of a level which I'd have loved to see in the original version, the Sky Base. Now as you can see, we've got what look to be cannonballs firing at us from a few directions, a few enemies dotted around, and of course the main thing you're seeing on screen right now is the lightning. Now that can hit you, so this is a level which relies on timing quite a bit, like the bridge level we saw a minute ago. This game actually requires you to perform some moves right down to the pixel, and I really could not remember why I disliked the jungle zone back in the day, until now. And some things I just don't like to talk about. And moving on now, I did eventually pass this section and move on to later levels, including of course the final boss. Now, I personally regard this as the hardest boss of the three versions we're comparing, with the SEGA Genesis or Mega Drive version being the easiest, and the SEGA Game Gear version, of course, being right in the middle. Now, I must top this review off by saying please do not assume that when I have a critical comment to say about a video game that I dislike it, because that's certainly not true. In fact, I love this game so much, I just happen to notice some bad things about it, only in comparison to other versions. Seriously, if any video game would be epic, it would be a SEGA Genesis / Mega Drive version of all three versions of the original Sonic the Hedgehog game bundled into one. Oh, and Sonic the Hedgehog 3 and Knuckles with the Ice Cap Penguins on your side, but that is a different story.